So hi everyone and welcome to today's webinar. My name's Kiara Simmons-Wood and I'm the Events and Marketing Executive at Charity Digital. I'm going to be your host for today's session and would like to give you all a very warm welcome. So today's session on how to make language more inclusive will be delivered by Ettie, inclusive and accessible communication consultant at Fighting Talk Communications. And the session will cover, among other things, how charities can avoid euphemism, how to champion respect and dignity, the principles of language around disability, how to disrupt the use of default language, and so much more. Now, just before handing over to Ettie, I just want to share a few house rules and pointers that will be useful for today's session. So the session is being recorded and will be uploaded to watch on demand within a week's time. And the slides and other resources will also be made available to you by the end of the day. You'll receive an email when these have been made live on our website, so keep an eye out for that. And closed captions are also available, and I'll shortly share in the chat how to enable these if you would like. Now, during the webinar, please ask lots of questions in the Q&A section of Zoom for Ettie to address at the end of her presentation. And feel free to share any other comments, experiences, or top tips in the chat section. And if there's a particular question that someone asks in the Q&A section that you'd like answered, you can also upvote these questions for them to be answered first. Finally, if you encounter any sound or image issues, please just let me know in the chat and I'll do my very best to get the session back to normal as soon as I can. Now, without further ado, let me hand over to Ettie.
Great. Thank you so much, Kiara. Thank you for that intro. So I'm hoping you are all able to see the slides okay. Just let us know if any issues there. So my name is Ettie Bailey-King. My pronouns are she, her. And as Kiara has said, I'm an inclusive and accessible communication consultant. On the left, we've got an image of me. So I'm a white person with shoulder length, light brown hair. I've got a massive grin on my face and a cozy jumper. And that big grin sums up how I feel about being here to talk to you all about inclusive language, because I'm really passionate about this topic. My background is in the charity sector, so I feel I'm in my home place on my home topic. So let's get into it. Today, we're going to talk about, firstly, what inclusive language is. Secondly, why inclusive language matters. And third, we're going to get into 10 practical tips to start us off so we can all start taking action. So what inclusive language is? A question for you all. I'd love if you could write something in the chat. What does inclusive language mean to you? So when I say those words, what comes to mind? What concepts, ideas, topics come up? Would anyone like to venture a definition, or just tell me thoughts and ideas that come to mind when I say inclusive language? Trishna says language that includes everyone in the room. Suzanne says not using language that is a barrier. Yep, big yes to both of those. Ian says language that encompasses all intersectionalities. Yep, I love that. So language that speaks to different things about us, our gender, our race, our disability. Language that does not exclude anyone. Everyone feels you're speaking to them, doesn't exclude, using the correct terms, easy to understand, prejudice-free, brings everyone in, welcoming and inclusive. Okay, amazing. You're all absolutely on it. We've got avoiding prejudice, feeling valued, so many great ideas here. So, as many of you have said, it's often defined as language which does not discriminate, does not cause harm, and does not perpetuate stereotypes. And all of that is true, absolutely. But I think we also sometimes fail to talk about what inclusive language does do, because we're so focused on what it isn't. And for me, what it does do is it accurately describes reality. So it points to structural causes of injustice. It doesn't let us believe that injustice just came about by accident. And it empowers people to describe themselves, which is not only about choosing the words that feel right for their identities, but it's also about being able to articulate their wants and needs in a way where people listen and those needs get met. So for me, it's never just about the words, it's about what the words make us do in terms of what behavior we then take. Do we then advocate more strongly? Do we then understand more deeply the injustice? It's all about why, what happens in the real world. So that brings me nicely on to why language matters. So a growing body of research tells us that language affects memory, perception, belief, and action. And I can't go into this whole amazing, rich body of research right here and right now, but if you're curious, just ask me. And you can also check out my website if you want to see more about that body of research. For now, I'll just sum it up as language changes how we see the world. And in fact, many experiences of discrimination and oppression happen through language, or I should say they first happen through language. And as Professor Lal Ziman tells us, Lal Ziman is an amazing sociolinguistics professor, says, open quote, "The bad news is that your language probably reflects the transphobic values of the culture you live in. But the good news is that changing your language can also help to change those cultural values." End quote. I love this from Lal, and I think we can apply it to other areas. We can say, the bad news is that your language probably reflects some systems of oppression, probably has hints of the racism we have all grown up with, the classism, the ableism, and so on. But the good news is that changing your language can also help to challenge those systems. So throughout these slides, you're going to see some little red crosses and some little green ticks. And I want to be very clear about their meaning. That red cross does not mean this word or phrase is banned. You must never say it. It's always terrible. And the green tick does not mean this word or phrase is always perfect, can be used in every scenario, and is without fault. What it means is, where there's a red cross, something is questioned or challenged. And where there's a green tick, I want us to encourage the use of it, or just think more deeply about it and advocate for it in some settings. So it's not a blanket yes or no. I'm going to get into the first of my practical tips. And the first one is to avoid euphemism. So a question for you all: who here has heard the word euphemism? Who here knows what a euphemism might be? Feel free to venture a definition in the chat, or give an example of a euphemism if you can think of one. Love that from Becky. I'm just going to powder my nose. So that would be a euphemism for going to the bathroom. We imagine that it's rude or impolite to say that we're going to the toilet, so we dress it up and make it sound nice. Cheryl says kicking the bucket is a euphemism for death. Exactly. We consider, or some of us consider, talking about death to be quite shocking, sometimes taboo. So we have this word that acts as a screen. Yeah, Andrea says it's another word for something. Gillian says it's language that suggests a different meaning. Absolutely. Yeah, nice. Under the weather. Definitely. So why is euphemism relevant to inclusive language? Let's take a look at just one example, and this one is about sexual orientation. So if we say that Chris plays for the other team, is a confirmed bachelor, or one that I heard in real life the other day, a friend of Dorothy, that is an example of euphemism around sexual orientation. And instead, if we just say that Chris is gay, or we use another clear preferred term, maybe by mirroring whatever word Chris uses about himself, there are some exceptions to that, we'll get onto that later. But if we just use a standard clear term, then we're just talking about that sexual orientation and saying, yep, he's gay, it's not a big deal, and it's not a source of shame. But when we use euphemism for talking about things like sexual orientation or disability, we're basically sending the message that there's something shameful about these differences when there's nothing. The only thing that's shameful is discrimination. So another example from disability, I bet that if you're anything like me, particularly if you went to school in like the 90s, many of us here were taught that it is more polite to say special needs or differently abled than it is to say disabled. Another one you might have come across is handy capable. And I was certainly encouraged by my teachers to use those words. But what the modern disability justice movement teaches us is that we don't need euphemisms for talking about disability, because we can be clear and standard. And we can just talk about disability for the state that it is, which is a state that is created by social systems and by design choices. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Again, I've got loads of resources on my website about talking about disability and understanding the social model of disability if you're curious. So I'll just say there is a little bit of debate about whether to say disabled or a person with disability. But here in the UK, the majority of us disabled people say disabled. Here's another practical tip. Let's be specific. So there's a lot of vague umbrella terms out there. Maybe we say LGBTQIA+, when actually we're not talking about all LGBTQIA+ people. We're actually just talking about trans people, or we're just talking about asexual people. And it's quite common that we use the broad umbrella term around topics that feel sensitive. And actually the risk with that is that it can obscure the specific wants and needs of the communities involved. So here's an example from race. It's a real example I came across from a partner charity, and they said, we're celebrating BAME stories during Black History Month. Now, there's two aspects we'll get into this. So the first one is, it was Black History Month and they were just sharing stories to do with Black history. So if you're only talking about Black experiences, say Black experiences. If you're only talking about trans people's needs, just say trans. The other thing I wanted to pull out there is that word BAME. So lots of you will know that BAME has been challenged, that many years ago it was dropped by the government. It's not considered a preferred term for talking about race. And preferred terms would be saying something like people of color, racially minoritized people, or my favorite one, which is global majority, because Black and brown people are the global majority, around 80 to 85%, and it's just more accurate in my personal opinion. So the 2 points I wanted to pull out there were, be specific and talk about who you're really talking about. Don't hide behind an umbrella term. And secondly, just a kind of challenge around that term, BAME. We can go into it in loads more detail if anyone's curious, but one of the issues with it is that it's just not a very useful term because it weirdly pulls out Black and minority ethnic experiences. And there's a kind of asymmetry there in the fact that it's naming Blackness and then subsuming all the other people of color under minority ethnic. So it's been really challenged by racial equity activists. I won't go into any more detail for now, but again, we can come back to it later. So next practical tip, be factual. So what do I mean by being factual? Well, if we talk about someone being confined to a wheelchair, that is not the most factual way of talking about it, right? Because it's bringing in an air of judgment. It's acting as though being a wheelchair user is terrible, as though it is a loss of freedom and liberty, even though the reality is that being a wheelchair user is incredibly liberating. And many wheelchair users say, I am liberated by my wheelchair. So it's just more factual to bring it down to the detail of uses a wheelchair, for example, or has a cane, or has a prosthesis, to bring some examples from disability. Taking that judgment out and just saying what the situation is. I've got another example here, also from the kind of health and disability space, which is that instead of saying that Kelly is afflicted with Parkinson's, which sounds quite dramatic, it brings with it an air of judgment, like this is a terrible burden that Kelly must carry. And instead we can just say Kelly has Parkinson's. It's more factual and it's just a little bit more accurate. Now, it's not saying that having Parkinson's is wonderful and your life is really easy if you have it. But one of the reasons that it's more useful to use that factual language is because research tells us that the more judgmental the language we use around disability, illness, or mental health, the more it reinforces ideas of shame and ideas of separation. And that can actually kill off a lot of the important empathy that we need to appreciate. And I love Claire's point that some people use a wheelchair as a mobility aid, rather than the assumption that everyone in a wheelchair cannot walk. Yeah, disability is often highly dynamic. I experience dynamic disability myself, so it can change from day to day, from hour to hour. You have lots of people who are ambulant wheelchair users who use one sometimes and don't all the time. So that's yet another reason why saying confined to just wouldn't be accurate. Another example, instead of saying that Ron suffered a stroke, suffered is bringing with it this rather dramatic kind of, oh no, how tragic and awful tone. And we can just say that Ron had a stroke or Ron survived the stroke. Again, we're not saying that having a stroke is wonderful, but we are just avoiding some of that creation of kind of dramatic ideas of victimhood, which can seem well-intentioned, but can actually lead to people feeling like their dignity is under attack. I'm going to go into a couple of principles of LGBTQIA+ inclusive language, but I do just want to note, as with everything I'm touching on today, it's a really big area. So I'm going to touch on some principles, and then we can draw out more of the nuances in the questions if you would like to. So first things first, not everyone is a man or a woman. We know this. There are lots of genders. You might be a man, you might be a woman, you might be non-binary, gender fluid, which means your experience of gender changes from day to day. You could be agender, which means you identify as having like no gender. And there's others. So instead of saying ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we could say something like, hey, colleagues, team, folks, you, all, good morning, everyone. The point is, we just don't really need to name that binary gender that often. And instead of saying both genders are welcome, we can just say all genders are welcome, or again, take gender out of the picture and just say everyone's welcome. Not everyone is a heterosexual man or a woman. So I'm thinking about invites to a charity Christmas party, for example. I remember getting one quite early in my career, which said that husbands and wives are welcome. And personally, for me, in my early 20s then, I was like, okay, well, what if, so this assumes that people are either a man or a woman, and lots of people aren't, but also like, what if I don't have a husband or a wife? I have a partner or somebody that I'm dating. So I think a message I want to get across with inclusive language is that a lot of the time it doesn't have to be about grand anti-oppression aims. It's about finding useful language. And in my opinion, it is more useful to say that partners are invited, spouses are invited, plus ones, people you're dating or whatever. It's just a really useful way of describing the fact that staff can bring somebody along to the party. Perhaps a Christmas party is not the most topical or seasonal example I could have come up there, but you can substitute in a summer party or whatever's more appropriate. So to that point earlier about umbrella terms, LGBTQIA+ is a massive umbrella term. And I want to call out that it brings within it both experiences of sexual orientation. And sexual orientation, that's who you're attracted to romantically, sexually, physically. We've got lesbian, gay, bisexual in there, and lots of others, for example, pansexual. So that's about orientation. But the umbrella term also has terms to do with gender in it, like being trans, like being intersex, for example. And intersex, again, we can cover this later on, I can share more resources, but it basically is a reminder that not every baby is born looking physically female or male. There's a wide spectrum of how human bodies look. So I just want to recognize that that umbrella term does so much and carries so much within it. And that's another reason it's so important to be specific, because if we are really just talking about asexual people's needs, then using the whole umbrella term just isn't accurate. So let's name the most relevant term. Just checking the chat. I think we're good for now. Okay. Having to come out can be really scary and really exhausting. And a question like, so if somebody asks me, what does your husband do for a living? Or if somebody asks, let's say a man, what does your wife do for a living? In that moment, the person that is being asked the question basically has to think for a moment that if they are like gay or bisexual or queer, they have to think, is it safe for me to actually answer the full question? And my full answer might be like, no, don't have a husband because I'm not heterosexual, or it might be because I'm not married. And that can just be over time such an exhausting and challenging experience, which can make us feel really unsafe in the workplace, even with people who we otherwise think are quite safe. So just practice simple tweaks that might remove the need for somebody to come out in conversation. So you could just say, do you have a partner? What do they do? It's the same question, you're still getting at the same concept, but the other person isn't having to think, do I come out in this moment? So in that example that I just gave there, where I say, do you have a partner? What do they do for a living? That is singular they. You already know how to use singular they. Every one of us here already uses it. So someone called for you, they didn't leave their name, they didn't leave a voicemail, they just said they would call back. That's singular they. My bike got stolen. I hope they get a flat tire. Or something less polite, we might say. Or staff should fill out their appraisals by Friday. That's a sort of non-specific they, where we're talking about unstated genders. Singular they is perfectly good grammar. It's been good grammar and it's been in use in the English language since the 13th century. Many of us feel a bit funny about using it. And I would say, it does take conscious effort to use singular they for an individual person that you have met if you're not used to it, because so much of our lives we're meeting people who work with she, her, or he, him. And so at first it does take a bit of, it's a mental adjustment. But once you get used to it, it's really, really simple. And it's such a powerful tool for not assuming people's gender and also not assuming people's sexuality. So in that example where I say, do you have a partner and what do they do? I'm not assuming my partner is heterosexual. My colleague is heterosexual, sorry. And related to that, just try not to guess gender in general. So you've got a conference, you're taking questions from people. Instead of saying, I'll take a question from the man in red because you see somebody with short hair, or the woman in red because they have long hair and makeup, you could just say, I'll take a question from the person in the red shirt, the person in the front row, or whatever is, some other neutral indicator. So sexual orientation. I quite often hear people talking about different sexualities, like being gay or bi, as sexual preferences. And I just want to flag that for many of us, that is not an accurate way of talking about it, because sexual orientation is actually a really core and enduring part of our identities. And to say preferences makes it sound like it's something that just changes like the wind. And for sure, people go on journeys in their own lifetimes of coming out, of discovering things about themselves. But I would just say it's more accurate and useful to talk about sexuality as either sexual orientation or sexuality, because it recognizes that core and enduring idea. Related to that, we'll talk about pronouns and why they're not preferred pronouns. But before that, just a general principle, which is if you really need to know how to describe someone, just ask. So you might say, so that I can introduce you, before you speak on the panel, can I check how you'd like me to refer to you? And then you're handing over all that freedom to the other person to maybe tell you their pronouns, but you're also not assuming that their pronouns are the same in every setting, right? We know that it's simply not safe to come out as trans or other marginalized genders in many, many workplaces. So you're not saying, what are your pronouns everywhere? You're saying, for these purposes, right now, right here, how do you want me to refer to you? So pronouns are not the same as gender, although it is for sure the case that the majority of people who use the pronouns she, her in the world are women, and the majority of people who use the pronouns he, him are men. So there is a broad tendency around that, but you can't tell someone's gender from their pronouns, and you can't tell someone's pronouns from what they look like. So just remember, somebody could be non-binary, which means that they know that their gender is outside of the binary of man or woman, but they could use any pronouns. So just try not to sort of automatically think, oh, Ashley uses the pronouns they, them, so Ashley must be non-binary, for example. They could well be, but they also could not be. So let's get on to sharing our pronouns. So has anyone seen pronouns shared in email footers, maybe in social media profile names? Does anyone have it in their email signature at work? Have we seen pronouns kind of showing up around normal life? Fab, yeah, Lottie's got it in her email signature and on Zoom. Vicky has it on social media. You've got them at YMCA Derbyshire. Email signatures, work emails, fantastic. Cheryl, great question. I'll explain what cishet is in a moment. Okay, so lots of us have got our pronouns coming up in public places. So for anyone who's not familiar, it's just more and more common to put your pronouns in brackets after your name, or just in places where your name shows up a lot. So you'll see I've got mine in my Zoom name right now, and I said mine at the start of the presentation. So why do we bother doing it? Well, firstly, it creates a mechanism for telling people how you want to be seen. So a really good friend of mine who now is he, him, he now uses the pronouns he, him, didn't always do that. When I first met him, his pronouns were she, her. And over the years, he's been on this journey of changing and learning and exploring things about himself. And that journey looked like going from she, her to using they, them pronouns. And he was able to do that because at work, everyone put their pronouns in their email signatures. And he was able to sort of make these steps to start saying, I think this is how I want people at work to be seeing me and talking to me. And then a few years later, moved from they, them to he, him. And just to stress, not everybody goes on that journey. It's actually not super common. But in this example, this person did. And it creates this mechanism where you can tell people, this is how I want to be seen and referred to. And without that mechanism, it can be really tricky. But the second thing it does is decenter the assumption that everyone is cis-het. And I've used a bit of a technical term there, cis-het. It just means that you're cisgender and you're heterosexual. So if you're cisgender, it means that the gender that you were assigned at birth, they were like, it's a baby girl. You grow up to be an adult woman. You know you're an adult woman. You know and feel yourself to be a woman. That means you're cisgender because the gender you got assigned and the gender that you know yourself to be is the same. It's on the same side. And you would be cis-het if you were also heterosexual. So all of that to say, sharing our pronouns just helps remind us that not everyone in the whole world is the gender that we might assume them to be. It just creates that moment of pause where I might think this person has short hair and looks very stereotypically masculine, and I'm really feeling like I can call him he, him. And then I might see their pronouns in their email and discover that actually that's not right. And now I know something about them. And they actually want me to call them they, them. But I couldn't tell that from looking at them. So it's basically just a simple structure for making public our, intentions for how we want to be seen. One note, being out is a choice. It simply will not be safe for everyone, everywhere to express the deeper truth of their gender identity. And it's very likely that people who perhaps want to be using different pronouns and just don't feel safe doing it. So let's remember that we shouldn't expect people, or we should at least remember that we can't see everything. And there may be people who are going on a massive journey with their gender, and that's not something we know about. But, if we're lucky, in maybe 5 years' time, they might tell us, or they might never tell us. So just a reminder that being out is a choice. So on pronouns, they're not preferred or chosen. We often say, tell us your preferred pronouns so that we can introduce you at the conference. Well, I want to gently challenge that word and say that they're not preferred or chosen, they just are. So if someone uses the pronouns she, her, like I do, my pronouns are she, her. And I do think maybe coming back to that sexual preferences example just makes it seem like it's quite trivial or not a big deal. And for me personally, feels more real and more respectful to just say, Ettie uses pronouns she, her, they are her pronouns. Gives it a little bit more ownership. We've got some great tips here for thinking about pronouns, and these come from Professor Lal Ziman, who I quoted earlier. And Lal tells us that you can think of pronouns as being a lot like names. You can't guess someone's pronouns from looking, just like you can't guess someone's name. You might look at someone and say, really feel like he's a Mark. And you might be right that he's a Mark and his pronouns are he, him, but you can't guess. There are lots of pronouns, just like there are lots of names. There are more than two. So I've used the example of they, them, but there's other ones. There's neo-pronouns like sie, sehr, and so on. It's not up to other people to decide what your pronouns are, and it's not up to other people to decide what your name is. It's up to you. And getting it wrong, so getting somebody's name wrong or getting somebody's pronouns wrong, isn't the worst thing. It's really not, just so long as it's handled well. And we're going to get into a few practical tips for how you can handle it well if you do say the wrong name or the wrong pronouns. Here's a broad tip. Generally, I do suggest mirroring people's words. So if you're not sure how somebody talks about themselves and then they say, I'm a gay man, that's often quite a good indicator that you could use the word gay about them. If they say that they have a husband, a girlfriend, a boyfriend, a partner, feel free to broadly say what they say. This is not foolproof. There are many words which is not appropriate to mirror. So one example would be the reclaimed slur word queer. Now, I personally love the word queer, and a lot of queer people really like me, like love using it, and it feels really joyful, but not everyone is comfortable with everyone saying it. So there are a few exceptions, and typically that's around a word that has a history of violence. And we know that queer, until only a few decades ago, had a really strong history of violence associated with it. So that's just one example where, you know, if I'm here and I keep calling myself queer, maybe you don't want to mirror that exact word if you are not yourself queer. But broadly speaking, I would say listen to how people talk about themselves and aim to broadly reflect that back. It's normally quite a good indication of what you can say. And here's just the slide saying the same thing I just said, which is watch out for those reclaimed slur words. Ask people. Let's use an example related to autism from neurodivergence. So over 90% of autistic people in the UK use identity-first language. Let's get into person-first language versus identity-first language. So person-first language looks like this. They have autism. She has a disability. You have vision loss. We say the person's name or their pronoun, and then we say that they have an identity. But identity-first language puts the identity first, often as an adjective, and it looks like they're autistic, she is disabled, you are blind or low vision. So let's go over that again. Person first puts the person's name or pronouns first and then says that they have the thing. They have autism, they have disability, they have vision loss. Identity first language focuses on the identity, often as an adjective, and says they are autistic, she is disabled, you are blind or low vision. I just went over it twice because personally I found it really tricky to learn about the first few times I was figuring out this difference. And I want to stress this point, not everybody agrees. It's not a hard and fast rule. It is not the case that 100% of disabled people in the UK all use identity first language. It is not the case that 100% of autistic people all use identity first language. It is okay that we have disagreement within our communities and that some people use identity first, like I use disabled. It feels true for me. I really love it. But, you know, many people, particularly outside of the UK, don't, and they use person first. So it's fine that we disagree. I think it's important to learn the history of where those terms come from and why they're favoured. And I've got some really simple free resources talking through the history of that, particularly with regards to disability, if anyone is interested. But really just that final point, it's okay that we don't use words exactly the same way. If I have a top tip for inclusive language, it's that we should recognise there is not perfect agreement, but we need to take a call, and we should take that call based on the perspectives of the people who are most relevant with the most lived experience. And we can say, we are using this language, we're using it because 90% of autistic people in the UK use it, and feel free to disagree with us, but we've explained why we took it. Or we're using this language because our service users overwhelmingly tell us that it feels right. Doesn't mean you have to use it. Here's another point about asking people. So I think it's obvious that in normal life, most of the time, we don't really need to talk about people. So if you have a new colleague joining you at work, you don't need to say like, hello, I notice you have a stutter. I notice that you use a wheelchair, or you have vitiligo, which is a skin condition, by the way. You know, we don't go up to people and say, look at you with your stutter. And yet, there are times when we do need to talk about somebody, and we actually might need to say that somebody has, let's say, a stutter, a stammer, or some other, I don't know, maybe another like identity or experience, because there's something relevant or practical that needs to happen. So maybe they need a reasonable adjustment during an interview. And in those examples where we need to talk about somebody because we're just trying to be useful to them, just ask that person what language they prefer. It's a really simple and really underrated tool to ask people. I think we often worry that it's rude to ask people anything about their personal identity, but I would say it's better to ask than to guess and get it wrong, because you might use a word that actually just feels really wrong and harmful to them. And I think it's okay to ask so long as, one, we have a clear reason for asking. So if you're just asking out of like personal curiosity, maybe leave that to yourself. But if you're asking so that you can be useful to them, so you can accurately describe them, great. Secondly, so long as you're polite and professional, you don't use it to kind of overstep the bounds of your professional relationship. And thirdly, so long as we actually listen and we actually respect what they tell us. Nothing worse than being asked, how would you like us to talk about you? This has happened to me many times when I'm speaking on panels, for example. Maybe I say I want to be described as queer and disabled because I love those words. And then they change the language and they describe me as a person with disabilities, and I didn't ask for that. So really, really important that we do follow through on that. So just to repeat that, explain why you're asking, and maybe don't put that person on the spot. So instead of saying, as I saw in real life at a conference a while ago, what are you? Bit blunt, bit strange, bit objectifying. You could say, so that I can introduce you accurately, can I check how you'd like me to describe you, or what language you prefer? Impact matters more than intent. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say that you've just got a delicious ice cream on a hot summer's day. Somebody bumps into you, it drops everywhere. And if you're like me, you'd be absolutely devastated. Well, we recognize that the impact there matters. The other person probably wouldn't say, well, I didn't mean for you to drop your ice cream, so why are you complaining? The other person is more likely to say, I'm really sorry. I can see that the impact is that your ice cream has gone all over the pavement, right? We focus on what has actually happened, not whether we intended it to happen. And if we're, really serious about making things right, we might buy somebody a new ice cream. Okay, silly, flippant comparison perhaps, but I think there's something in there about recognizing impact and not trying to deflect from the harm by saying, well, I didn't mean to cause it. Because if we've caused harm, it doesn't really matter whether we intended it on the whole. So some tips for how to apologize. How to correct a mistake. Firstly, I just want to say, everyone says things they don't mean, and that is absolutely okay. I will have said things today in this presentation that were not exactly what I intended, and that is just part of working with language, and it's just part of being human. So when, not if, you make a mistake, firstly, I recommend that you acknowledge it, mark it in some way. You don't have to do this in a 1, 2, 3 order, but you could go, I've said slur term, I'm so sorry. I should have said gay, for example. So just mark it in some way. And secondly, apologize. But only apologize if you can keep the apology brief and sincere. A lot of the time, you can actually cause harm by going into an elaborate, over-the-top apology, which centers you as the person who made the mistake. It is typically more appropriate to just keep it short and really mean it. If you are so sorry, say that you are so sorry, and then just focus your energy where it matters, which is avoiding repeating the mistake. So keep it brief, acknowledge the error, apologize, and focus on not saying it again. And then another action you can take in the future as you start to learn more and want to kind of spread what you're learning is you could say, when somebody else uses that harmful term, perhaps they use a slur term, you could say, I used to say that word too, but I recently learned, and now I say this instead. And you can just share whatever learning you've been on, whatever perspective made you rethink that. You could also step in when somebody says something that you consider harmful, and you could say, I noticed you said harmful word, and then just so you know, and then just like really briefly talk through your perspective on why they might want to reconsider saying that. Notice that in these examples, you're not having to say like, stop, end the conversation, you're a terrible person. You're simply marking it and sharing that you have done some learning around that word. And I've seen that. I know it looks very, very simple. I've seen it be incredibly powerful in organizations that are trying to shift their culture to be a little bit more inclusive and equitable. So I'm going to pause there. I will leave you with one kind of call to action, which is that here we've got some screenshots from my website. We've got colourful images, and we've got titles of articles about simple writing, accessibility, disability, and pronouns. And I just encourage you to go on my website, which is fightingtalk.uk, if you want to get free resources. And there's free resources on talking about gender and sexuality, disability, accessibility, and lots of things like that. So if you like free information, do go there and check it out. So I'm going to pause the presentation now, and we can move on to questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Ettie. I found that really interesting. Now, we've had lots of questions come in already, so I'm going to dive straight into those. And if anyone has any other questions, feel free to add them in now or upvote the existing questions, as I'll be addressing these with the most upvoted first. So the first question is from Lorna, asking how best should we describe skin color when adding alt text to an image? A course I attended told everyone to use the term a diverse group of people. That's not very descriptive.
What a great question. Yes, Lorna, I would share what I'm picking up on there, which is some frustration around that. So what is alt text? When an image doesn't show up on a website because of poor connectivity, alt text is what shows up. It's like a written description of the image. If a person uses a screen reader, which is software which sort of speaks aloud content, so it's typically used by blind and low vision people to listen to the words on a website, then alt text is the description of the image that gets read aloud. So the really key point with alt text, right, is it is actually a substitute for the image. So I'll refer you back to the example. There was a photo of me on the first slide, and I said, there's an image of me, I'm a white person, I've got light brown hair down to my shoulders, I've got a big grin, and I'm wearing a beige jumper. And at the risk of repeating myself, we're actually saying what is in the image, right? And my frustration with saying a diverse group of people is, on one level, that's a description of the image, but it doesn't tell you if there are 7 Black people with long flowing hair. And so you're thinking, okay, it's a group of mainly Black women. And are they wearing really joyful, colorful clothing? And what's the vibe of the image, right? If we want that alt text to actually tell us something meaningful about the image, we've got to stop and think like, okay, imagine that image didn't show up because it hasn't loaded on my computer. What would I need to know about the image? And I find practicing this with like memes and jokes is a really good way of starting. So imagine you wanted to send a meme to a friend and like your WhatsApp isn't working, so you can't send it, but you want to say, I saw this really funny image and it was like a screenshot from the Barbie movie and Margot Robbie is doing this and the joke is that. So how can we like tell the content and tell the story? I will say there actually are times when it would be fine if the image just says a diverse group of people, but that will be if the image is basically not conveying something important. So it really matters the context of the article. Is it an article all about Black women in leadership? Then I really want to know if it is a group of Black women, and that's going to be important. Is it somewhat more decorative? Then it's going to matter less. So really think about the purpose of the article or the piece of social media and the audience and what they need to know. And I would say, if in doubt, be really specific. So I often say that I'm a white person, which frankly is not very specific. I probably should be going into that in more detail. And I think, you know, there's some wonderful examples of great alt text out there. And I've got some people linked on my website who do it really well. So Haben Gerber, I'm just going to put her name in the chat, is amazing at this and often describes herself beautifully and lyrically. Okay.
That's great, thank you. And you also actually wrote an article for Charity Digital on how to write great alt text, which I have pasted in the chat and will also be shared on our slides and resources page. So I recommend everyone to go check that out. Now the second question from Beth is asking, are there media guidelines around inclusive language when it comes to health and disability? Unfortunately, we see some of these terms widely used.
Great question from Beth. Yeah, so sort of afflicted with, suffering from, a victim of, I think, yeah, that was the language we were talking around. No, I would say that in my experience, there are no authoritative media guidelines, which, you know, credibly can be said to represent health bodies, or can be said to sort of speak to anyone who's in the health and disability space. There is broad guidance, which just comes from listening to relevant affected people. So I guess that's my key point with all of this. It's like, personally, I'm not a wheelchair user. I don't have an independent perspective on the language around being a wheelchair user. I am just listening to people that I know that are wheelchair users. And many of them are people that I've just met on Twitter. Like, it doesn't have to be your best friends, but as we listen, we hear loud and clear this very clear message that is saying repeatedly, call me a wheelchair user. That's how I like to describe myself. So in the absence of official guidance, I really think we can just go back to asking who is most affected and what are they telling us. Now, I also recognize that's very easy for me to say, right? Because all I do is inclusive language and accessibility all day, every day. So it's very easy for me to say, we know what wheelchair users are saying, but you probably don't have the luxury of spending all of that time doing that. So I would say, where possible, follow on social media people with those relevant identities. You will learn so much from these activists and thinkers. They're just absolutely brilliant. And also, I plug for myself, but an apologetic plug for myself, just find people that are sifting through all of that information for you, who can give you that digest. And I don't want to be super simplistic and say that we can boil down thousands of people's perspectives into one tip, but there are broad trends. So like, follow and surround yourself with the people who can feed you those summaries. And here is one of them, and there are others.
Yeah, I just smiled because I actually followed you on LinkedIn the other day, and I'm finding it really interesting. So yeah, a shameless plug, and I love it. So the next question is from an anonymous attendee, and they've asked, how do I influence my colleagues who don't care about inclusive language so they see the value of it?
Yeah. Firstly, compassion for anyone who is in that situation. It's really tricky. I have been that person so often in an organization, really trying to advocate for the importance of inclusive language, saying, you know, it feels important. Our service users are telling us it's important, and feeling like you meet some resistance. That can be so frustrating. My general tip there would be, lead by example. So start modeling in your own communication, wherever possible, the changes that you would like to see. Clearly, there's some examples, you know, where you wouldn't have permission to totally rewrite a report or change the words on the website. So not that, but just start showing it in your own communication. As people get curious, they may ask you questions, and you can do that sort of like, well, I used to say this and now I've learned that, and that's why I'm using this kind of storytelling. Also, just share resources and learnings. So podcasts, videos, articles, newsletters, whatever you're surrounding yourself with, which is beginning to shift your perspective. So following amazing activists on social media, just start sharing that in the spaces that are available to you. So if you have kind of Slack channels, or I don't know, like even in in-person meetings, I have one colleague who at the end of every team meeting, they suggest one article that they think everyone in the whole charity should read. And it's been really fascinating seeing how that's opened people's minds up. So just start small and basically start by making visible the journey that you're on and sharing what has helped you go on that journey.
That's really interesting about the meeting. I think I might actually suggest that to our marketing team. We do have in our weekly stand-up with the whole organisation like a recommendations deck where people can add anything from a podcast to a theatre show they went to see, or a restaurant. But I think, yeah, we have seen quite a few like good suggestions come in, especially related to podcasts. So the next question is from Fiona, and they ask, interesting to hear that gender and pronouns can be different. I always thought they were gender pronouns to reflect gender identity. Could you explain the difference in more detail, please?
Absolutely. So I'm cisgender. Like, as a baby, they were like, it's a girl. And I've grown up to be someone who knows and feels myself to be a woman. So they're aligned. I am cisgender. I've got a newsletter about this for anyone who's curious about that difference. And I bring that up because I want to flag that as a cisgender woman, I don't really want to be trying to speak for and explain other people who have kind of like experiences of gender that I haven't lived. So I'll keep it really brief so I'm not kind of stepping on other people's experiences. But basically, pronouns can be, it very much can be a case that someone, let's say, is a trans woman, and they use she, her because they're like, I am a woman and I'm using she, her to tell you that I'm a woman. So you're absolutely right that many times it actually can be a gender pronoun where you're literally saying, see me as a woman, I'm a woman, I know and feel myself to be a woman. But unhelpfully, I want to contrast that and say that there also can be plenty of times when it's actually not that. And you might have someone who uses they, them, just because they're really figuring stuff out and they're like, I don't know what I am, and I just need that time to like not be gendered. Or they might use they, them. I actually have a friend who identifies as a woman, but uses they, them for quite different reasons, to do with feeling like, you know, there's just still more exploration happening and they, them feels right. And in that example, using they, them isn't really a gender pronoun for that person. But it is still serving an important purpose in terms of getting seen and recognized how they want to be seen. So I recognize that is a really confusing one. I think the answer is some of the time, and maybe even a lot of the time, yes, gender pronouns are gender pronouns, but also some of the time they're not.
Okay, that's great, thank you. And Jodie's question is actually very interlinked. And Jodie stated, really interesting to hear you make the case that the word preferred shouldn't be used before pronouns. I've always thought of gender identity as a state of being and pronouns as a preferred way of presenting, but would you instead say that pronouns are actually another facet of identity rather than a way of representing your identity?
Such an interesting question. So again, I'm a cis woman, so I'll try and not do too much kind of like gender splaining for people who have very different experiences. But just my understanding from the people I know and work with and learn from is that, yeah, a lot of people tell me the pronoun is, yeah, a piece of identity. And many of us who've learned about gender in recent years have probably learned about, you've got like gender presentation. So that's like long hair or short hair, makeup, what style of clothing you wear. It's like how you look and show up in the world. And then you've got gender identity, which is what you know and feel yourself to be. I know and feel myself to be a woman. That's my identity. Even if I started dressing in a really masculine way, even if my gender presentation shifted masculine, I would still know and feel myself to be a woman. And I think what I'm hearing from a lot of activists is that, yeah, pronouns could be considered more like a part of presentation. So very, very interesting question. I won't pretend to be an expert on that one, but yeah.
No, that's great. I found that really helpful. So the next question is from Hannah, and they have asked, can you clarify if person first or identity first is generally preferable when talking about or to someone else rather than them talking about themselves?
Fabulous question, Hannah. Yeah, okay. So to recap, person first, that is, I am a person with disabilities. And identity first is, I am a disabled person. In the example of disability, and if we are based in the UK, the vast majority of disabled people within the like UK disability justice community, most of us are using identity first. We are mostly saying we're disabled people, we advocate for disabled people's rights, we use identity first. Identity first language is linked with the social model of disability. So I say I am disabled, and it's basically the beginning of a sentence, and the end of the sentence is I am disabled by social structures and by design. So actually, in some settings, I feel really, you know, way less disabled. If I'm in an environment that meets my needs, I can barely feel disabled at all. And then I go into an environment that doesn't meet my needs, and suddenly I'm feeling a lot more disabled. So one of the reasons that identity first language is preferred is because for people like me, it just feels more accurate to say that. Whereas if you're a person with a disability, that language is suggesting that the disability is with you, it's in you. That's the kind of medical model which says that it's like, basically, and I'll paraphrase a bit here, it's like your fault if you end up not being able to get the things you need. So that's some of the background why disabled is so strongly preferred by many people in the UK, but not everyone. I would say that when talking about disability, it's a really good bet to go with that identity first language. If you're not sure, you could say, hey, you know, if you're talking about someone, you could be like, we're starting a disabled rights group. My colleague who's disabled is leading it. Can I just check what language you're using? If in doubt at the beginning, probably you're fine to go with it and just have that little sort of opportunity for the you know, as real people start coming into that space, to change it as you wish. I won't ever say that there's always like a perfect way of doing any of those things, because yeah, you will meet people who disagree, but yeah, identity first has a certain politics associated with it, and it is, yeah, often a good place to start.
That's great, thank you. And this actually interlinks to a question that Steve asked earlier in the chat, saying, on LGBTQIA+, is this not a safe option, as it can be dangerous to assume, and asking might appear to be prying or make the individual feel uncomfortable?
Yeah, what a thoughtful and sensitive question. That's a really, really great point. Yeah, so I would say context is everything. It's all about why you're using that term. So yes, if you're using it so that you avoid asking someone a deeply personal or inappropriate question, so that you can just group people in a way where you're helping their needs, go for it. Absolutely. That's awesome. I'm more talking about times when we slightly hide behind the umbrella in situations where we should be or could be boldly stating what people need and how we can better like advocate for their rights. I think in your example, perfect. Go with the broad term.
That's great, thank you. I hope that helped. So the next question is from Cheryl, and they've asked, if we have different language now from what we learned at school, is it likely that language will continue to morph all the time, and how can we keep up with it?
Absolutely. Yeah. Language is for sure evolving every day. And we know this because we probably use really different language with our colleagues now than we did when we first started our career. So a word that I now see is really acceptable in most work settings is cool. You can be like, cool, great point. Cool, see you at the next meeting. And that's seen as like really pretty acceptable in most places. And someone told me that when they started their career, I think it was like 30 years ago, that was very controversial and would have been super inappropriate in the workplaces that they started. And we were just like musing on how that one has evolved. And so I think it's absolutely right and good that there are changes in how we use language in general, because that's what language does. It evolves with people. And whilst it's true that the language around anti-oppression does evolve pretty quickly as, you know, people's rights are being fought for, I think it's important that we don't let that intimidate us. And I don't think that's what your question was saying, but I know that for some of us, it feels like because the language is changing, we're like, well, that's it. I can't possibly talk about anything because it's always changing. And I want to, again, just have so much compassion for those of us who feel it, because it is really intimidating when you're learning about a topic and you're like, well, that's not the language that I got taught at school. Like, how can I keep up with it? So firstly, huge compassion for that. It's scary, but also just some reassurance and a bit of a kind of encouragement to not worry too much and not overthink it. Yes, the words evolve, but so do all the words that you use in the rest of your work. You probably talk about cloud computing now, which I certainly wouldn't have talked about a few years ago. I wouldn't have known what that meant. We learn new words, we learn how to use them. And so long as we're just grounding everything in trying to not overthink it, ground our language choices in relevant people's perspectives. So, you know, don't worry too much about what a load of non-disabled people are saying. Listen to what disabled people are saying. And I think we can't go too far wrong if we do that.
Great, thank you. And sorry, my allergies are just acting up all of a sudden. So Cheryl actually asked another question. We had someone yesterday saying that blind is a derogatory term. This person had no sight issues. Are they right?
Wow, I will refer you to many, perhaps I can send over a suggestion of, again, really awesome people to follow on social media, some brilliant blind activists. I don't know the full context, and maybe there was some deeper nuance to this and this person knew about some niche setting, but what I'm overwhelmingly hearing from blind people that I know and blind people that I work with is, oh, absolutely, blind is a preferred term for how many blind people are talking about themselves. And actually a friend of mine put in a proposal to speak at a conference, and he described himself as a blind man. And the conference came back and said, you're going to have to call yourself visually impaired. No, you're going to have to call yourself a person with vision loss. And he was absolutely baffled. He said, are you joking? Firstly, I was born blind, so I haven't lost any vision. I'm just blind. And secondly, if you're going to censor me and describe how I can talk, then I'm out. I'm not interested in it. So yeah, my understanding is that blind is good and preferred, and we just need to be listening to blind people.
Great, thank you. And that fits in great with the next question from Alf, who asked, why did you feel that queer shouldn't be mirrored? Queer people have worked hard to reclaim it. It's how I expect to be referred to rather than gay.
Yeah, so I love the word queer. I use it about myself. It's joyful and one of my favorite words in the whole world. I think in many, many settings, it can and should be mirrored. And in many, many contexts, it's clear to me, and I don't want to generalize too much, but I think among just slightly younger people I'm working with, it is like a standard, clear, factual, approved term for talking about like not being heterosexual. I do still think there are exceptions. I have worked with people and they happen to be a bit older than me. I'm not saying it's an age thing, but I've worked with people who grew up and experienced violence associated with that word and for whom it literally brings back terrifying memories. In that setting, I do not expect that colleague to mirror my use of the word queer because that is not going to be appropriate for him. I also think there are settings where if there's just not an environment where people are like really clued in on talking about sexuality and gender and they're not like kind of really in that world, although they mean no harm by it, they will think of the slur term use of it. And again, they may not feel comfortable. They might be like, oh, wait, hang on. But my understanding of the history is that word. And again, I wouldn't expect someone to mirror my use of that word if it doesn't feel right to them, if they're going to be really anxious as they use it, that they're causing harm. Now, as we get to know each other, I will quickly be able to reassure them of that. It will be clear, it will be all good. But I'm not going to kind of immediately expect that to be mirrored, just because personally, I would be recognizing that people have different understandings of it. And in some cases, you know, it has been associated with terrifying violence. So yeah, I'm with you. For me, it's a really, really joyful word. And I do love to see it mirrored, but I just wouldn't expect it 100% of the time.
Great, thank you. Now we have time for just one more question from an anonymous attendee who said, at work we provide support for the whole family and say this includes specialist support for brothers and sisters. Should we be saying siblings?
For me personally, I would say siblings. It's one word instead of three. It's clear, it's simple. I think there's exceptions. So if your content is going to be translated into other languages, I know there's other languages where that's not working out so well and it gets really complex and you might actually just have to say brothers and sisters. Another example would be if you're working with people who speak English as an additional language, sibling is a less commonly known word. Like I don't know how to say sibling in a lot of the foreign languages where I do know how to say brother and sister. So I think we should really recognize, like, will it be understood and how will it be used? But broadly, I love sibling. It's, you know, it's clear, it's useful, it captures everything, and it's quicker and easier and more inclusive.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ettie. And now I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. But yeah, thank you once again, Ettie, for joining us, and to everyone who attended and has been so engaged in the chat. I love to see everyone interacting and commenting and sharing their ideas. If you could share your feedback with us, that would be fantastic. I've pasted a link in the chat, and you will also receive a prompt just after you leave this page. And finally, our next webinar will be about how to write for social media on 17th of August at the same time from 1 to 2 p.m. I will also paste the link in the chat, but you can also find it on our website at charitydigital.org.uk. So bye for now.